Good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Ricky Riccardi, and I'm here ready to talk about Louis Armstrong. I want to thank the American Center in Moscow for having me. Thank you for everybody tuning in all around the world to hear my little my little life story. Um, we will be taking questions. If you have any questions at any time, just drop a comment and I will be answering them in the last 15 or 20 minutes. But I'm here today to talk about Louis Armstrong. I'm assuming if you're watching this, you know about Louis Armstrong. In my personal opinion, the most influential and important musician of the 20th century. You probably don't know about me, which is fine. And you'll know more about me than you ever wanted to in the next 40 minutes. But my day job is I am in charge of the research collections for the Louis Armstrong House Museum, the world's largest archives for any single jazz musician. And when the American Center asked me to do this presentation, they said, if you have any video or footage or audio of when Louis Armstrong came to Russia, that would be great. Unfortunately, Louis Armstrong never made it to Russia in his lifetime. But in 1975, 4 years after he passed, the New York Jazz Repertory Company did a tour performing Armstrong's music. And one of the great things about the Louis Armstrong House Museum, I mentioned we have the world's largest archives for any single jazz musician. It is all digitized. If you were there and have any memories and would love to share it in the comments, that's great. But this is a short video that originally aired on CBS television in the United States. It was sent to Lucille Armstrong, Louis Armstrong's widow. And we're going to play this video right now. It's a CBS News story about that 1975 tour when Armstrong's music finally came to Moscow.
For the past 3 weeks, from Yaroslavl to Rostov-on-Don, the latest Soviet-American cultural exchange has been bringing to Russian ears the kind of music that is usually heard here only through the static of an overseas broadcast on shortwave radio.
Два крупнейших произведения 50-х годов «Hello, Dolly» и «Make Me Nosh». Hello, darling. Hello.
The New York Jazz Repertory Company was here celebrating the 75th anniversary of the birth of Louis Armstrong. Tickets cost up to $5 at the box office, expensive by Soviet standards, and the black market rate was 5 times higher, but nearly all 10,000 seats were filled. Moscow audiences are said to be the most cynical in the country, the toughest to please. But one Russian jazz fan said, "This is a big hullabaloo," and the rest of the crowd seemed to agree. The musicians said a repertory company couldn't get crowds this big in the United States, and one surprised himself when he made a quick tally and said, "We're drawing more people here than the Rolling Stones are in New York." Richard Roth, CBS News, Moscow.
If anybody was there in 1975, we'd love to hear from you. And before I show my little presentation, I wanted to show off my shirt today. This is Louis Armstrong as Superman, because to me, he is the great American superhero of the 20th century and beyond. And we're here on an incredible week. Yesterday, July 6th, marked the 52nd year since Louis Armstrong passed away in 1971. July 4th is the date that Louis Armstrong celebrated his birthday. And last week, we cut the ribbon on the brand new state-of-the-art Louis Armstrong Center in Corona, Queens, which I will be telling you more about later today. So to be here talking about Louis and my personal relationship to him and the work I do, it's the perfect timing, kind of a dream come true. I'm going to now just go take you through a photo slideshow here. That is a big part of my job, folks. If you want to know Who is in charge of Louis Armstrong's trumpets? The answer is me, Ricky Riccardi, which is, like I said, a dream come true. This has been a long time coming. For me, I was born in 1980. Louis Armstrong died in 1971. So I never got to meet him. I never saw him live. But when I was a kid, I spent a lot of time listening to old music, watching old movies. I couldn't find a great picture of me when I was a kid, but I did find this. Oh, my goodness gracious. That's me at the age of 12 years old, in the local newspaper. And if you notice there, I was already watching 1930s comedies, Laurel and Hardy, Abbott and Costello, the Marx Brothers. And so I loved old culture, but it wasn't until 1995, when I was 15 years old, that I saw the movie, The Glenn Miller Story. And all of a sudden, Louis Armstrong comes on screen and he does one song, Basin Street Blues. And that one song completely changed my life. Nothing was ever going to be the same after I saw him. And so my mother took me to the local library here in Toms River, New Jersey, and I checked out a cassette compilation, which you see on your screen right now, called 16 Most Requested Songs. And this was all material that Louis Armstrong recorded in the 1950s that was produced by one of his closest friends, a man named George Avakian, who was actually born in Russia in 1919. And George produced these albums. Louis Armstrong plays W.C. Handy, and Satch plays Fats, Ambassador Satch, Satchmo the Great. And when I heard that music, specifically a 9-minute version of St. Louis Blues, that was the moment that I knew, my life had changed. Nothing was ever going to be the same. Something kind of shifted in my brain. I now needed to learn everything about Louis Armstrong. I needed to listen to everything. I needed to hear everything. And so I started doing my research. And when I would read these books, I kept coming across the same story, which was that when Louis Armstrong was a young man, he was a genius. He basically invented the rules of jazz. He changed the way people played music on their instruments. He changed the way people sang. But then around 1929, he, quote unquote, sold out. He went commercial. He started singing love songs, and he started clowning around, and he was doing Hello, Dolly and What a Wonderful World. And he kind of wasted his talent. And I did not agree with that, because the music he made in the 1950s and 1960s is what changed my life. So I began dreaming of, boy, wouldn't it be great if I could write a book one day about Louis Armstrong's later years. And that's how the whole thing started. I'm still back in high school. Flashing forward a little bit, I went to Rutgers University in New Jersey, where they had a program where you can get a master's degree in jazz history and research. And on the campus was the Institute of Jazz Studies, probably the world's greatest jazz research center. And the director at the time was a man named Dan Morgenstern. There's a photo of me and Dan at Rutgers at that time. And Dan knew Louis Armstrong. Dan became one of my heroes. He taught me so much about Louis Armstrong. He's still alive today, 93 years old. He's won, I believe, 9 Grammy Awards for writing liner notes. Just a brilliant man, and he taught me so much. So I spent 2 years at Rutgers. I got my master's degree in jazz history and research, and I wrote a 350-page master's thesis about Louis Armstrong's later years. And at that point, I said, all right, this is great. Now I'm going to get a job. Now I'm going to go out and work, and now I'm going to spend my life talking about Louis Armstrong. Unfortunately, there weren't many jobs for a jazz historian in the United States. And so my father, he owned a house painting company. And so with my master's degree, I went to work. For 4 long years. I painted houses, usually outside in the summertime, sweating all day, back-breaking work. But this is what I did. I had met my wife. We had just gotten married. And, everybody kept saying, don't you want to try another job? And I kept saying, no, don't worry. One day it's going to happen. And I continued doing my Armstrong research. This is a picture of Louis Armstrong at his home in Corona, Queens. And of course, he has his trumpet in his right hand, but right next to him is a tape recorder. And beginning in 1950, Armstrong made about 750 reel-to-reel tapes where he would talk about his life, he would talk about his music, he would talk about traveling, he would talk about his upbringing in New Orleans, he talked about anything and everything. And I knew that those tapes were at the Louis Armstrong Archives at Queens College in New York. And so in 2006, when I was still painting houses, I started doing research there. And my whole thesis was that Louis Armstrong was great in every decade, and that in the 1950s, he was making some of the best music of his career. Well, the first tape I ever listened to as a researcher was Louis Armstrong in 1956 talking about how he was playing better than ever and his records were better than ever. And I knew it. I said, this is going to be it. So I started doing all my research there. I started listening to all the tapes. And then eventually in 2007, I started a blog. This is the first blog I ever posted. It was July 13th, 2007. This was right before social media kind of exploded. But I started this blog where I would paint houses all day, then come home, kiss my wife hello, and then sit down and write about Louis Armstrong. And I started getting a reputation. And by 2008, I was invited to go down to New Orleans for an Armstrong conference called Satchmo Summerfest. And it was there that I met the great George Avakian. There's a photo of me and George Avakian, who had produced all those records in the 1950s that changed my life. And I got to give multiple Armstrong presentations. That's my third presentation right there. My wife took this photo. She came on the trip with me. I ended up getting a standing ovation when it was over. I felt like all my dreams had come true. That was on a Sunday. I flew home on Monday, and then on Tuesday, I was still painting houses. But in New Orleans, I had made connections. I mean, there's the great writer Gary Giddens, and the man in the middle is Michael Cogswell. And Michael Cogswell opened up the Louis Armstrong Archives in 1994, and he had opened up the Louis Armstrong House Museum in 2003. And I had gotten to know Michael from doing research there. And he finally said, hey, we just got a grant to hire an archivist. Maybe you should apply. And so in 2009, I applied and I got the job to be the archivist for the Louis Armstrong House Museum. I said goodbye. Me and my father. This was my last day as a house painter in October 2009. My wife and I had just had our first daughter. Her name was Ella. She was 6 months old. And now I was going off to the big city to work with Michael. There's Michael and I at the Louis Armstrong Archives. The main reason I was hired, there was a man named Jack Bradley, who was the world's largest private collector of Louis Armstrong materials. He was one of Louis Armstrong's best friends. He was also a photographer. And the Armstrong Archives had acquired his entire collection. And so I was hired to process that collection. And on my second day of the job, I got to get in a van, drive to Cape Cod, meet Jack Bradley, and pack up the rest of his collection. That's me and Jack outside the van. 48 hours earlier, I was still painting houses, but now I'm sitting with one of Louis Armstrong's best friends, packing up his collection. And that was it. That began the job as archivist in 2009. There's an early photo of me holding one of Louis Armstrong's reel-to-reel tapes. I mentioned Armstrong made about 750 of these tapes. I think the only two people who've listened to every tape are Louis Armstrong and me. So that was a wonderful part of the job. And as I mentioned when I first started today, I'm the gatekeeper of his trumpets. So there's an early picture of my still remains a dream job for me. The people I've gotten to meet over the years. Here's Wynton Marsalis at the little. I'm showing him one of Louis Armstrong's trumpets. The legendary Quincy Jones. So I've met all of these legends, all these people who've come to Queens, New York, who love Louis Armstrong. And Louis Armstrong has also helped me get around the world. You know, here's me in Italy and with a pizza in 2011. And I went to London in 2015 and 2017 to talk about Armstrong. And just last year, I was in Brazil talking about Louis Armstrong. So from a big Louis Armstrong fan to be able to do all this kind of stuff is kind of amazing. And I mentioned early on, part of the job was digitization. And so maybe I'll put some links in the chat at the end, but we received a $2.7 million grant to digitize the entire archives. That's how I was able to share that video at the top of the presentation today. For over a year, we had a team. Here's some photos of the team. They came in every day and they scanned every page. They took photos. We digitized all the videos. We digitized all the audio. Here is one of Louis Armstrong's scrapbooks from 1932. They worked on those. They scanned every page. It just brought it back to life. It was really an amazing process. We have 12 collections, 60,194 items, over 15 terabytes of material, 40 batches of metadata, 111 scrapbooks, 6,500 records, sound recordings, 16,000 photographs and negatives, 7 trumpets, 356 videos, 500 arrangements, 315 posters. That's the Louis Armstrong Archives. Like I said, that's what I'm in charge of. And here's a screenshot. Again, I'll put the link in the chat, but there's a website, collections.louisarmstronghouse.org. And anybody from around the world can create a free account and search our entire archive, listen to these tapes, watch videos, read autobiographical manuscripts. It's all there on the website. So that's one part of the job. I mentioned early on the exciting portion. What you see there is myself and the staff in a construction setting. And what that is the Louis Armstrong Center. This is a project that Michael Cogswell told me about when I was hired in 2009. The Louis Armstrong estate had helped purchase an empty lot directly across the street from the Louis Armstrong House Museum. And Michael said, wouldn't that be great one day to turn that into the new home for the archives, a real state-of-the-art visitor center. And so it took years and years and years. I'm sad to report Michael Cogswell passed away in 2020, but he was there for the groundbreaking. And for the last 6 years, we have watched it, an empty lot turn into a building. This was an exciting day when we were able to just walk in and see it. And there it is today. This is a photograph that was taken just last week of the brand new Louis Armstrong Center right there on Armstrong's block in 2000, on 107th Street. And this is now open to the public. Yesterday, we had our official opening day. And so if any of you out there travel to New York City, you can go to louisarmstronghouse.org and learn about the center. You can book a tour in advance. You can buy tickets in advance. And like I said, it's the new home for the archives. We have a state-of-the-art exhibit area that was curated by the great Jason Moran. And that is that's kind of the end result of what we've been working towards since I started the last 14 years of my life. So that is a big part of it. But then there's also Ricky Riccardi, the author. If I just had the Armstrong Archives job, that would be enough of a dream. But that first dream that I had way back in high school to write a book about Louis Armstrong's later years, that finally came true in 2011. And this book came out, What a Wonderful World, The Magic of Louis Armstrong's Later Years. And this book picks up with the start of his small group, the All-Stars, in 1947. And it goes until his passing in 1971. Now, that book came out in 2011. And at that point, I thought, my job is done. I had my dream job. I'm in charge of the Armstrong Archives. My book that I fantasized about is now a reality. I no longer have to paint houses for a living. This is going to be great. And I didn't realize at the time that actually it would get better and better and better. I only planned to write one book. But when I started going out and giving lectures, giving presentations, I began teaching a Louis Armstrong college class at Queens College. I realized a lot of people knew the later hits. They knew What a Wonderful World. They knew about the duets with Ella Fitzgerald. And a lot of people knew about his 1920s works, things like West End Blues and Potato Head Blues and things that really kind of shaped the course of jazz to come. But they did not know about his middle years when he was a big band leader and he became the first Black pop star in the United States and the world. And so I began working on book number 2, which came out in 2020, called Heart Full of Rhythm, The Big Band Years of Louis Armstrong. And so when that book came out, I was very proud of that. Jazz Times magazine named it the best book of 2020. And I said, great, okay, I've now written 2 books. I'm done. Story. And so I started writing my 3rd book, which right now is being titled Stomp Off, Let's Go, The Early Years of Louis Armstrong. For this presentation today, I finished my first draft of the book 2 nights ago. It should be published in 2025, and then my work will be done, at least in terms of books. I will have 3 books. I never planned on doing it backwards, where my last book covers his birth and my first book covers his death, but it's actually been kind of enlightening doing it this way. And, I hope everybody out there, if you want to learn more about Louis Armstrong, these 3 books will definitely get you covered. So I have the archives job, then I have the author job, and then last year I was named consulting producer on a film, Louis Armstrong's Black and Blues, which is streaming around the world on Apple TV. And this was kind of a pandemic project where Imagine Entertainment and Apple TV wanted to do a Louis Armstrong documentary. They got the blessing from the Armstrong estate, and the pandemic, COVID-19, started. But fortunately, the entire archives were digitized. And so I was able to help them every step of the way, getting them photographs, getting them videos, everything in between. They interviewed me. If you find the trailer on YouTube, you'll hear my voice. So again, I never could have imagined that happening, that I'd be working on a film, but that came out last year. And then one of my favorite things I get to do is work on Louis Armstrong reissues. This started in about 2012 when Universal Music, they contacted me to help them with a 10 CD Armstrong box set. And they noticed that I had a lot of ideas. And so I started hitting them with every idea I had. We need to do the complete Decca singles. We need to do the complete Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong. The complete Satchel Moët Symphony Hall. And Universal was very kind, and they said yes to everything. So from 2012, for I guess the last decade or so, almost every major Armstrong reissue I've had the pleasure to work on. The photograph you see right there, that is a master tape from the album Ella and Louis. I think everybody around the world loves the Ella Fitzgerald Louis Armstrong duets, and I co-produced and wrote the liner notes for a complete set called Cheek to Cheek, which is streaming everywhere. And that is that photo. So that's another fun part of the job. Not only did I get to come up with ideas and watch this become either a CD set or an LP set or see it streaming, but I actually got to hold the original tapes, hold the original metal parts. And so early on in this presentation, I mentioned that my life was changed when I heard Louis Armstrong plays W.C. Handy, and especially the version of St. Louis Blues. I was 15 years old at that time, and I mentioned that was produced by George Avakian. Well, flash forward to about 2017, there's a label in the United States, a company in the United States called Mosaic Records, and they put out box sets of an artist. They'll take one artist, they'll take one period in their life, and they'll do a complete box set. And so I wrote to Mosaic Records and I said, I would love to do the complete Columbia and RCA Victor recordings of Armstrong, because it includes all of the material that changed my life back in 1995. And Mosaic Records approved of it, and Sony Records approved of it. And in 2019, we were in the studio. That is me smiling very broadly as I'm holding the master tapes for Louis Armstrong Plays W.C. Handy. The original tapes from 1954 are in my hands right there. And the funny part is, one of the days we were in the studio, it was the anniversary of that first time. The first time I'd heard that music was October 1995. And I put a little montage just to show the straight line, hearing that music, and then the years as a house painter, and now I'm sitting in the studio holding the master tapes and co-producing and writing the liner notes for a box set. So that box set came out in 2021, and Mosaic Records, they always submit their releases to the Grammy Awards, and so they submitted my liner notes. I wrote 30,000 words, a big fat booklet. It could almost be considered a book. I wrote 30,000 words just on the music in that set, and we submitted it to the Grammys. And then the biggest shock of life, it was nominated. That was the first shock. I was watching it on TV, and they had the nomination ceremony, and found out that I was nominated for a Grammy in the album notes category. So that's my medal, my medallion right there. That's the cover of the box set. And so just to say nominated for a Grammy, that's, I keep saying dream come true, but it was another dream come true. But if anybody is here today and they saw the publicity for today's talk, where this is going. On April 3rd, 2022, I'm in Las Vegas with my wife, and they called my name, and next thing you know, I'm a Grammy winner. I was going to show the videos, but they're all online. You can watch them. But here's a fun photo of my wife and myself afterwards. I'm wearing my tuxedo. She's wearing her dress. We went to a restaurant called Fat Burger. We had cheeseburgers and milkshakes and celebrated the victory of the Grammy. And there is the photo of me holding it backstage. Though the funny part, they don't tell you that is actually not my Grammy. When you win the Grammy, they hand you a fake one. And then as soon as you walk off the stage, they take the fake one away. And so I had to wait a few months, and eventually, if we can stop sharing here, I'm actually done with the presentation. Let's see. All right. So show and tell. This is the real one. So this came in the mail last year, and I think you could tell by my joy. I still feel very, very, very proud of that accomplishment. So that's a quick summary of how I've gotten here. Like I said, there's a million Louis Armstrong fans in the world. I think almost any one of them, would be thrilled to get to do what I do. I still don't believe it. And I never take it for granted for a moment. There's not a day that goes by where I feel that I kind of am getting bored, or it's time for a career path. I meet a lot of people who think that I'm kind of a trained archivist. That was my job title, but I never went to library school. I totally got into this because I've devoted the last 28 years of my life, my 28 out of 43 years, to Louis Armstrong. And like I said, it's paid off, writing 3 books, getting to tour around the world, winning a Grammy, being there this week for the opening of the new Louis Armstrong Center. If you would have told that kid in Jersey, with the glasses in the 90s, or if you had told that house painter back in the 2000s that any of this would have been possible, I don't think you would have believed it. But I'm here, and I'm just, still going. There's still a lot more to come. I am not slowing down. I'll put it that way. I teach courses online for jazz at Lincoln Center. So if anybody's interested, you can go to their website. They have a program called Swing University, and Swing University presents online virtual classes that anybody around the world can take. And so I love teaching about Armstrong. I'm going to be doing 7 sessions for them starting in October. And then I'm already on the phone with Mosaic Records. We might be doing another Armstrong box set. Fingers crossed. I don't want to jinx it, but there might be another Armstrong set coming out in the future. And like I said, being in Corona yesterday for the official opening of the Louis Armstrong Center, watching people come in from around the world, taking tours, touring the exhibit. I got to show the archives, the new archives, to a lot of people. It's so exciting. I just can't believe any of it is true. I can talk about myself and talk about Louis until I'm blue in the face. But questions are coming in, and I would like to address them. So, question number one: can you share a memorable encounter or a valuable piece of advice that has significantly influenced your professional journey? Oh, that's a great question. Wow. All of the encounters have been memorable. There was something about talking to the people who knew Louis Armstrong. That became a big thing with me early on because, like I said, I was born in 1980 and I knew I wanted to write this first book about Armstrong. But in 2002, his bassist Arvell Shaw, his pianist Joe Bushkin, and another bassist, Jack Lesberg, all passed away. And I was 1 year away from starting the program at Rutgers. And I said, I was so close, I need to talk to these people. And so beginning in 2003, I was able to interview the clarinetist Joe Moraney, the piano player Marty Napoleon, the drummer Danny Barcelona, the bassist Buddy Catlett. I was able to interview the vocalist Jewel Brown. I mentioned Dan Morgenstern. I mentioned Jack Bradley. I mentioned George Avakian. And those encounters kind of shaped me and my research because I wanted to know. I could read books all day and I could read magazines, but I wanted to know from the people who were there, what was Louis Armstrong like? What did his trumpet sound like? And so all of that, kind of made me who I am. And sitting here today in 2023, the only people who are still alive are the vocalist Jewel Brown and the historian Dan Morgenstern. Everybody else I interviewed, they all passed away. And so I was able to at least capture their stories. And now I try to tell their stories and try to share the wisdom that they shared with me. As far as a piece of advice, I know I've been encouraged from day one. I would be nothing without my parents and without the support of my wife, Margaret. Part of it, those house painting years, I think were probably where everybody was getting a little worried about me. And because my dad, he kept saying, I didn't put you through college to be a house painter. And then I should mention when, writing a book does not happen overnight. And so I hired an agent in New York City and we wrote a proposal and we sent it to probably 20 different major publishers. And so I had people saying, maybe you should try a different job. Maybe you should try to self-publish your book. Maybe you should, give up altogether and, be a school teacher or something. And there was something in the back of my mind where I just kept saying the whole time, it's going to happen. And the phrase using was, it's too important. I had a feeling that what I was working on was important. I really believed in that. And if I had to paint houses, or if I had to wait, to get my dream job, or if I had to deal with some rejections, it was important, and just stuck with it. I had a feeling that this could all work out. And so it might not be a specific piece of advice, but I credit my parents and my wife for just their support, because they saw how much this meant to me. And it was just like, all right, he knows what he wants. Keep going. And extensive archive. What have been some of the most intriguing discoveries that you've made about Armstrong's life and work? So for me, I mentioned those reel-to-reel tapes, 750 tapes, probably 2,000 hours of audio. And I've listened to everyone. I know Louis Armstrong better than I know some of the members of my own family. And so that was very important to me because, like just a clown. He was on stage every night, smiling and, popping his eyes out and entertaining. But, everybody wondered, what was he like off stage? And so there were some books that were written where people said, oh, this was all an act. This was all fake. When he would get off stage, he would be a different person, this and that. What I came to the realization of is that Louis Armstrong, most of the time, was the same person on stage as he was off stage. He lived for his audience. He loved to laugh. He loved to bring joy. There was something in his spirit, I think, that was instilled in him in New Orleans, because he grew up so poor. I mean, the word poverty, I don't even think covers it. Yeah, he didn't have shoes. He had to quit school. Him and his sister had to get food out of garbage cans. His father left him soon after he was born. His mother had to work as a prostitute. It was a very tough childhood. And then now he's got this life where he is one of the biggest stars in the world. He's traveling every night. He's making music for audiences everywhere. And he never let that get to his head. He never let it, he never became pompous or pretentious or, feeling like he was better than everybody. He was still that kid from New Orleans. And so when he met people, he always gave them his whole heart, his whole soul. And that was one of the biggest things, listening to all those tapes and hearing him laughing, hearing him telling jokes, hearing him talk to kids, hearing him with his wife. I said, oh my goodness, this is the most genuine man who ever walked the face of the earth. He was so comfortable in his own skin. He knew who he was. He knew what he brought to the table. And Jackie Bayard, the great jazz pianist, once said he was the most natural man. And I think that was the biggest thing, listening to these tapes. Having said that, he was also a human being. And that was the other side of the tapes that was very important. Hearing Armstrong angry, hearing him holding a grudge, hearing him cursing. That side of him, the world did not see. He was very careful to make sure that did not get out to the public. But he managed to keep it all on his tapes. And so that, I think, is very important because, again, it's that New Orleans kid. You had to be tough to survive his neighborhood. His neighborhood was so dangerous in New Orleans, they called it the battlefield. And so, he never lost that toughness. Was he warm? Was he friendly? Was he joyful? Yes. But if you crossed him, or if you told him something about music, or if you told him what to do, or if you were condescending towards him, that old battlefield attitude would come out. And so I think that was very important. So anybody who reads my books, I try to quote Louis Armstrong on every page. I'm a writer. I'm doing my best to tell these stories, but the way I see it is Armstrong made these tapes because he wanted to be in charge of his own story. During his lifetime, there was a lot of stuff written about him that was wrong, that was mean, and, it was kind of hurtful. And so we have a few tapes where he uses the phrase for posterity, that he was making these tapes for posterity. He knew one right about him. And so why not be in charge of your own story? And so that's where I feel my role comes in. It's kind of not so much defending Armstrong, but really letting Armstrong speak for himself. I mean, there are moments where I quote him and stories I tell where, even I don't agree with him, but it's just like, he still deserves to be heard, specific topic. That's fine. But I do think that's why he did this. He knew that one day, someone like me, who was born 9 years after, or now at the Armstrong House, I mean, we have interns who were born in the 21st century, and they're researching and they're listening to his tapes. And so that, I think, is a very long answer. But those were the things that I got from just intriguing discoveries. Armstrong is real. Armstrong is human. Armstrong is funny. Armstrong's whole collection, set up his whole archive for posterity, for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years. He knew people were going to be studying him. He wanted them to study every part of him, his music, his life, his personality, warts and all. It's all there on those tapes. All right. Question 3. In the course of your research, how have your views on Armstrong's impact on jazz and popular music evolved? So the deeper I get, the more I learn. When I started this whole life of mine, as I mentioned, my thing was the 1950s. I was fixated on the 1950s. I said that was Armstrong's greatest decade. And I said, the jazz world kind of let him down and nobody was paying attention to him. And he knew how great he was. And I know how great he was, but everybody's sleeping on that music. And when when that book came out and when I was able to do these reissues for Mosaic Records and everything, I was fortunate. People agreed with me. A lot of people listened to the music again. A lot of people read the book and they said, you know what? He still was great. The big evolution for me was I had an impact he had, especially on Black audiences in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Actually, throughout the 1930s and 1940s. One of the best things about writing books 21st century is so much material has been digitized. So I knew I wanted to write a book about the big band years of Louis Armstrong, 1929-47. If you had asked me 5 years ago to talk about those years, here's what I would have said. I would have said the music's great. Louis might be in the best form of his entire career, but wasn't very popular. The bands weren't that great. Audiences didn't really follow him. Black audiences were already kind of not following him, turning their back on him. It breaks up the big band because it was struggling so much. And then he forms the small. That's the beginning of my next book, and in my opinion, the best portion of his life. Well, I started doing research papers, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the New York Age, the New York Amsterdam News. They were written by Black writers and aimed for Black audiences. And that's when I realized that I was wrong. Louis Armstrong was a hero. He was a power. He was an icon to the Black community during this whole big band period. And yes, this is when the jazz writers, most of whom white, loved him. They loved him in movies. They loved his records. He broke the box office records at the Apollo. And so that was kind of mind-blowing with my second book, Heart Full of Rhythm. The next book, again, I had read everything there was about early Louis Armstrong. And in my mind, it's kind of like, well, Hot 5 recordings, Hot 7 recordings, 1920s, he's changing all the rules. I get it. And it wasn't until doing the research, again, the glory of digitization. There were so many interviews with musicians who were there. And in the researching for this next book, I've been able to access these interviews and hear this from the sources and realizing that everything Armstrong did for the rest of his life, he was doing when he was a kid in New Orleans. He was funny. He was doing comedy. He was dancing. He goes on the riverboats. He's doing pop tunes. He's singing. He's scatting. He's playing slide whistle. And it was just this kind of like, oh my goodness, got into this world, the usual thinking of the young innovator, the young genius, and the old clown. He was, as a big band leader, he had these values with the small group all-stars in the 50s and 60s. And so the world changed. The sound of jazz changed, bebop and swing and this and that. Audiences changed, but he was very consistent. And so I think when this next book comes out, kind of the story, it's I feel like I'm writing an instruction manual. How did Louis Armstrong become Louis Armstrong? That's going to be the story of the next book. So I have not stopped learning for a minute. Question 4, my top 3 jazz artists of all time, and why do they inspire me? Number 1, Louis Armstrong. I don't think that's a surprise. And number 2, I think this is me personally. If I was to name, I think the 3 most influential, I would say Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker. That's it. You need to start there, end there. You get everything you need. Coltrane, Miles, and they're all great. But Louis, Duke, Bird, that's it. For me personally, Louis is number 1. And then Lester Young is my number 2, tenor saxophonist. Just the most lyrical, melodic, feathery, light player. I love him in every decade, but check out Prez, as they called him, behind Billie Holiday, by himself with Count Basie. His sound goes right. Fats Waller came to me early on, also in the 90s. And I think there was something that I found incredibly inspiring about these African-American artists in the 1930s, when there's racism, there's the Great Depression, there's Jim Crow, and there's people like Louis Armstrong and Fats Waller who are dealing with that reality every day. Yet when it's time to make music, all they wanted to do was create joy. They wanted people to feel good. They wanted to make people laugh. They wanted to make people relax. And what did when I was a teenager, I wasn't aware of all the history yet. I was still learning, but I knew how Armstrong made me feel. I knew how Fats Waller made me feel. And to this day, if I listen to Louis or Fats, if I'm in a bad mood, it's anything, Louis Armstrong and Fats Waller. And then the genius and poetry of Lester Young, that's where Ricky Riccardi lives. But for the jazz world, I would say Louis, Duke, and Charlie Parker. Question 5, what personal characteristics do you think have been most instrumental in helping you succeed in your career as a historian and an advocate for Armstrong's values? Personal characteristics. I should say, I should have said this early on, I'm not used to talking about myself. I talk about Louis Armstrong all the time, but me and my personal characteristics, I probably know better than mine. But I will say research has always been in my blood. I showed you that article when I was 12 years old. When I was watching Laurel and Hardy and the Marx Brothers and people like that, I would read about them. And when I got into Muhammad Ali, when I was about 11 years old, and this big 500, 600-page book by Thomas Hauser came out, Muhammad Ali videos. So I've always had that brain that when I find something, when I discover something, I need to learn everything there is about it. And then I get very passionate about it. And I want to share it with everybody. You need to see this. You need to hear this. Did you know that this happened? And so that was already kind of hardwired into my system before I discovered Louis Armstrong. Now, when I discovered Louis Armstrong, that was it. It was like all the sharing it with others. That's been my whole life. So definitely all those things that were there with me when I was very young, that was it. It was just like, I need to just, tell the world. I shout it from the rooftops. I love Louis Armstrong. Should too. That's kind of where it comes from. We have one more question, and we are also running out of time here. But can you tell us about a challenging moment in your career and how you handled it and what you learned from it? I'll repeat myself. I think it was definitely that house painting period, 2006, 2007, 2008, because I had a master's degree. I was painting houses, and the book was getting rejected by every publisher. My wife was getting nervous. My parents were getting nervous. And somehow, as I mentioned before, I just said, I'm going to keep going. This is important. I'm going to do it. But I had to do something. And so starting that blog, blogs we kind of laugh out now. We're sitting here with social media every day, and people are updating. My Threads now is the latest, all this kind of stuff. But back then, a blog was kind of your only way. And so I attribute a lot of my success to starting that blog in 2007. The first entry, which was written on a day when I painted houses, because I just had to get it out there. I had all this passion for Armstrong, all this knowledge. I figured if I just put it on paper and put it out in the world, maybe someone will respond. And I would say the first 6 months, I don't think I had any readers. There was no social media to promote it on, but eventually a trickle, mostly from Sweden and the Scandinavian countries. And then I heard from the researcher, the biographer, Terry Teachout. He was writing a book on Armstrong. He started emailing me. And then I heard from New Orleans, and New Orleans invited me down for that first talk. And soon after that, I got the book deal. And to me, it was just like, that was it. So it was all those things. I never let the rejection stop me for a second. But also I knew that even if it wasn't going to make money, I just had to get it out there. And I think the word, to sum it all up, and again, I'm uncomfortable talking about myself, but passion. If you have a passion for something, it could be Louis Armstrong records, it could be anything. It could be cooking, it could be, whatever gets you going in your life. If you have a passion and you treat it seriously, this is not a joke to me. This is my life. This is my livelihood. If you have a passion, treat it seriously. This is possible. I'm not saying that's, just be passionate and next thing you know, you're winning a Grammy Award, but it takes a long time. It takes a lot of hard work, a lot of rejection, a lot of challenges, but just keep that passion burning, share it with the world, get your thoughts out, get your minds out, find like-minded people, find people to share it with, whatever it is. And it'll definitely improve, I think your quality of life. Oh, this is good. We're actually going to go long because questions are still coming in. So let's keep going. But passion, passion, passion. It's gotten me through a lot. And here we go. Finally, looking back at your early stages of your career, what advice would you give to your younger self or to anyone interested in a career in music research and preservation? I think I kind of answered it, but if I took a time machine and found that kid in 1995 who was watching the Glenn Miller story and listening to that 16 most requested songs, I would say, don't give up. Don't quit. Learn it all, study it all, meet people you need to meet, reach out, talk to Dan Morgenstern, meet Louis Armstrong's musicians, get out there, start a blog, do these things. And it might not happen overnight. It might take a long time, but a reward is coming. And that would be my advice to myself. And for anybody out there interested in music research, preservation, like I said, we live in this world now. We're in a digital world. We're in a virtual world. If you're getting rejected, if you can't find a job, you can't find a steady, paycheck, you might have to paint houses. You might have to wait tables. You might have to work retail, do these things. But if you keep that passion burning, if you find something, and in this day and age, between social media and websites and podcasts, there are so many do-it-yourself ways now to kind of get your voice out there. And sometimes it's hard to be heard. Sometimes there's too many ways out there to be heard. But you can't let that discourage you. Like I said, when I look back now, and those house painting years feel like a blip, a snap, here and gone. But back then it was 4 years, 365 days a year. So we're talking about 1,400 days. It did not feel like a blink of an eye. It did not feel like the snap of a finger. It was long. And so I think that's my big advice. Keep the passion burning. Don't give up. Find the right platform, whether it's a podcast, whether it's YouTube, whether it's social media, whether it's a website. If you want to write. If you want to research. Find other people like you. Find other researchers, other archivists. Learn from them. Find a subject matter. If it's music research. My oldest daughter, Ella, is a metalhead. She loves heavy metal. She plays electric guitar. And in her, I recognize me, because she'll hear Ozzy Osbourne or she'll hear Eddie Van Halen, and then she's on YouTube, and then she's reading, and then she's telling me facts, and then she's finding the pages on Instagram. And so that for me, it's kind of wild because I'm getting to see it play out with all my children. I have 3 daughters, Ella, Melody, and Lily, and they all have different passions. But Ella's got the music gene, and I'm like, that's it. She's got what drove me. And once you got it, you can't get rid of it. So you might have to paint houses, you might have to wait tables, you might do odd jobs, but just keep it burning. Don't give up. Don't let rejection slow you down. And just get the word out. We need more people out there writing about music, more people out there researching the music, more people out there talking the music, spreading the love of the music, sharing the music. I'm only one person. I every time Ian and Jack Bradley and all the people who've made me who I am, they're coming out of my mouth. And so do the same. Learn it all, figure it out, and just keep going. And then on that looks like the final question. So I just want to say thank you so much. Thank you to the American Center in Moscow. Thank you for everybody who tuned in from around the world. Again, Louis Armstrong House. If you're coming to Queens, New York, you could also follow me on social media. I'm everywhere, Instagram, and I'm on Threads now too. But definitely keep in touch and listen to Louis Armstrong every day. That's my medical advice. It's better than anything. It'll get you through a lot of hard times, and it's gotten me this far, and I think it'll do wonders for you as well. So thank you again to the American Center Moscow. Thank you for watching. I wish you all a very good night, very good evening, and pops is tops, as we say. Thank you.